If you have ever lived like this, busy every day, too busy to stop and ask what your life is actually being spent on, then do not be too quick to call that a meaningful life. Messages pull you. Work cuts your day into pieces. Responsibilities keep arriving. At night, you are so drained that you keep scrolling just to feel like the day gave you something. But when the day finally ends, you know the truth. Another square is gone, and you cannot clearly say what you truly gave it to. A lot of people are not lacking effort. A lot of people are using busyness to avoid the real question. Kieran first felt this in a place called White Bell City. It was a strange city. It never became fully dark. Even at night, thousands of pale clocks glowed at the tops of towers, turning above the rooftops like a river in the sky that never stopped moving forward. Everyone in White Bell City was busy. Messengers crossed the high glass bridges. Accountants counted late into the night. Merchants traded under clocklight. Scholars rushed with stacks of paper under their arms. Even the men drinking in the taverns looked like they were in a hurry. Everyone seemed to know that time was precious, and yet everyone lived as if time would never run out. Kieran was one of them. He was 35. He lived in a stone apartment near the center of the city. There were always papers on his desk, always messages waiting, always some unfinished task sitting in the room with him. He was not lazy. He was not without ambition. In fact, he had always told himself that he was simply passing through a busy season. Once things settle down, I will really begin living. Once I earn more. Once I reach the next position. Once my life is stable enough. Once I finally have time. He kept saying that until one day, in an old stationery shop, he saw a sheet of paper that changed him. It was hanging in the least important corner of the shop. No gold border, no decoration, just a field of tiny squares, row after row, line after line, a cold, careful grid. The shopkeeper was an old woman, sitting behind the counter, grinding ink. Kieran asked her what the sheet was. She looked up once and said, "That is 90 years. He did not understand. She took the paper down and laid it flat in front of him. "1 square is 1 week, she said. If a person lives to 90, that is about how many squares they get. Kieran stood there and felt something go cold inside him. Because the sheet was not very large, not large enough to feel like a whole life. It looked thin, finite, fragile, as if one careless hand could tear it in half. The old woman handed him a pen. "Cross out the weeks you have already used." At first he almost laughed. It felt theatrical, almost cruel. But he took the pen anyway. He started at the top left, 1 square at a time. The further he went, the slower his hand moved. Those first squares were the years already spent. Childhood, adolescence, leaving home, his first job, his first conviction that life was finally about to begin. Then came all the years that had been eaten by tasks, duties, and the vague promise that the real life would begin later. By the time he reached his current age, a large section of the page had already darkened. He stood there staring at it, not because he had never known that people grow old, but because for the first time he could see that a life is not an endless road. It is a wall with a limit. Every week you live, 1 square disappears. No one gives it back. The old woman looked at him and said, "The people in White Bell City are very good at one thing. They cut their lives into pieces, trade them for things that are barely worth having, and then comfort themselves by saying there is always tomorrow." He took the paper home. That night, he did not light the usual lamp. He did not continue the work on his desk. He just sat there, the page open in front of him, and for the first time, he let the mathematics of a life enter his body. 90 years, if he was lucky, was only this. If the first part of life passes before you even understand what life is, and the middle is spent working, carrying, paying, rushing, recovering, promising yourself that rest will come later, and if by the time later arrives, your body no longer carries time, the same way it did at 30, then how many usable squares are really left? That question kept him awake. A few days later, he went to see an old friend. The man's name was Lucan. He lived in a wind tower, far outside the city. When they were young, Lucan had been as fast as anyone, fast with work, fast with money, fast with thought. Then one day, he had quietly stepped away. Some said he had gone mad. Others said he had simply become clear. When Kieran arrived, Lucan was repairing an old clock in the top room of the tower. The clock had been opened. Its gears lay exposed in careful layers. The room was almost silent, except for the small metallic sounds of tools against brass. Lucan saw the sheet of squares in Kieran's hand and did not look surprised. He only said, "So you finally saw it too?" Kieran asked him why no one tells the truth about this earlier. Lucan smiled faintly. Because most people are too busy surviving their lives to examine what their lives are being spent on. Then he placed one gear back into the clock and said, "The greatest power of busyness is not that it makes you productive. It is that it helps you forget you are dying." The sentence was heavy, but Kieran did not argue because he knew that was exactly what White Bell City was doing and exactly what he had been doing too. Busy enough not to think, busy enough not to feel, busy enough not to ask the only question that really mattered. If life is not endless, is this really what I want to spend my squares on? After a while, Lucan asked him something else. "How old are your parents?" Kieran answered. Lucan took out paper and began doing arithmetic. If you see them only a few times a year, and if the time when you are truly present with them is less than you imagine, how many real meetings do you actually have left? The number was small, much smaller than Kieran expected. So small that the phrase, "I will make more time later," suddenly sounded ridiculous. Lucan said, "Most people believe they still have years with their parents. What they really have is a number, and the number is usually far smaller than they are willing to admit." This subtraction is not only about parents, it applies to old friends, to siblings, to lovers, to children. Some departures feel ordinary only because you do not yet know that they were the last one. These words fell into Kieran like quiet snow. He did not collapse, but his sense of time began changing. When he returned to White Bell City, nothing outside had changed. The bills were still there. The demands were still there. The city still burned through hours, like it had an infinite supply. But he had changed. When his mother spoke, he no longer kept half his attention inside a screen. When he walked beside the person he loved, he actually felt the air instead of spending the whole walk inside tomorrow. When a friend sent a letter, he no longer told himself he would answer when life calmed down, because he had begun to understand that the things that shape a life rarely arrive with dramatic music. They arrive quietly. A meal, a conversation, a walk, a shared afternoon, an ordinary reunion, and once the square is crossed out, that exact moment is gone forever. He also noticed something else. When a person truly sees how few squares remain, many things that once felt enormous begin to shrink, not because they stop existing, but because they stop deserving. Whole pieces of your life, comparison, vanity, petty conflict, the endless pressure to look like you are winning. He began asking one clear question whenever some new urgency appeared. Is this worth one square of my life? Sometimes the answer was immediately clear. No. Years passed, Kieran kept the grid. Then he began drawing versions of it for other people he loved, not to frighten them, not to make them sentimental, but to remind them that each of us is living on a sheet that is smaller than we think. Do not keep saying, "There is plenty of time," not when you have never really looked. Years later, someone asked him what awakening about life had actually felt like. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "It was not that I suddenly learned how to treasure life. It was that I finally saw how little of it I could really afford to waste." This is Otherworld Radio. Real clarity is not filling your days more aggressively. It is looking at the squares of your life as they disappear and admitting you do not have as many later years as your mind keeps pretending. When you begin taking responsibility for each square, time stops being something that only passes through you. And slowly, it becomes something you actually lived.